Yes, yes. I mean, it's preposterous that we should have, private oil companies, who are looting. And what's the justification to have some private oil company here taking our wealth away from us? That's the people of Canada's wealth. It's unjustifiable. But as I say, throughout the Cold War, whenever you had governments who tried to nationalize the commanding heights of their economy, there was assassination attempts done against him. Even right now with Hugo Chavez, there's allegations being made that he was taken out, right? And so obviously the problem is you had, Pierre Trudeau with his national energy program. And because that coincided with different historical developments like the Arab oil embargo and other things that, caused it not to be successful, that you have this kind of attitude that because the first attempt in Canada to do a national energy program failed, we should never try again, which is a pretty illogical way to approach things. And obviously there's very powerful people who sponsor university symposia and who sponsor books and sponsor scholarship that addresses this idea of, we can't do anything with the state, we can't do anything by nationalizing our resources, even though that would clearly be to the benefit of working class people in this country. And so, yes, I mean, it is kind of odd that you have in Toronto, the Toronto area where most Canadians live in the east of Canada, you have, I gather, them importing oil from Venezuela and other countries when we ourselves in Western Canada have all this oil wealth. So I myself, I'm not against selling oil to China. I'm not against selling oil to the United States. I just think that the profits should go to the people. Like Venezuela still sells oil to the United States, even though it's an enemy of Venezuela and has tried to sabotage the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela. But the main thing is, where do the profits go? That's the ultimate question. I don't mind who consumes our oil, really, what their ethnicity or which state buys it, which company buys it. It should be for the people that the profits go. That's the main thing.
Absolutely. Now, a big concern in recent news here the last few months is obviously the sale of the state, or rather Nexen, to the Chinese National Offshore Oil Company, which is a Chinese state-owned oil company. And for us to sell a majority stake of our resources here in Canada to an offshore state company, first of all, is something extremely rare in Canada, but also is something that, to me, is absolutely ludicrous. So, Josh, what's your feedback?
Well, I don't want to see China being scapegoated, because actually oil companies from Texas have been looting our oil for decades now in this country. And so just because this new cast of characters includes some Chinese companies, I don't think that it changes anything. The ethnicity of the owners of the company shouldn't be used as a justification for us being even more outraged than we would be anyway from private companies coming from other countries. But what is very interesting is that the Chinese people can have their state company here, and Norway can have its state company here, and Norway's state company puts profits away for future generations, as we know. I gather they hired a philosopher to formulate Norway's oil policy and to grapple with profound ethical and moral questions revolving around oil wealth. But we here in Canada, we're not allowed to grow up like the rest of the countries and have a state-owned oil company. So we can have China's state company here, Norway's state company here, and yet we're not allowed to have our own state company because the National Energy Program, Pierre Trudeau's agenda several decades ago, it will be half a century, not long from now, it will be half a century since Pierre Trudeau tried to do his National Energy Program. And yet we can't, go back and reevaluate our oil policy because, unfortunately, that we have this kind of very, very powerful oligarchy in this country that wants to obviously use the profits that are in this country for themselves, right? I mean, if you were someone who's making billions of dollars, if not trillions a year from the tar sands, you're not going to be very accommodating to people who say, well, actually, we think we should, nationalize these resources. I mean, that's antithetical to their worldview. And so that's a real obstacle, is that you have people, universities, you go into the University of Calgary, you look at the rooms, they're sponsored. This room is this oil company paid for this room, this hall is paid for by that rich capitalist. So the capitalists dominate. Like Marx said that the ideas in a society, the legal system, the education system, that was the superstructure, and that the economic mode of production dictated all the ideas that are prevalent in a society. And I think to a large extent it was true. In our society, the rich people, their ideas, their philosophy, their worldview really finds itself disproportionately represented among the professoriate, because those professors who are willing to parrot their propaganda get lucrative grants, and it's very corrupt and nepotistic, and So the ideas that manifest themselves in the media and in the education system tend to be ones that serve power. And coming back to what we were talking about earlier, that's why there was this outrage and outcry by the mainstream media, who tend to be people who apologize for for those in power, that I was actually attempting to do scholarly work that actually challenged those in power, because that's not something they're really used to.
Now, obviously, you have been made a target by the powers that be, and obviously the powers that be don't want you telling the truth to the general population. How do you purport to get around that, and what do you do to defend yourself against persecution as far as people criticizing you and trying to demonize you for telling the right story, telling people the truth as it is?
Well, in Canada, it says in our constitution that we have freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, freedom of the press. And that's all very well and good on paper, but it's no use unless you use it. And I tend to have this feeling that with democracy, it's use it or lose it. And I don't ever feel there's a final victory for democracy. We often get told that Canada is a democracy. But for me, I feel like, democracy is an ideal. It's kind of like saying Canada is a utopia. Yeah, we'd like Canada to become more utopian, more democratic. But there's never a final victory. So we have to struggle day in, day out, week in, week out, to use these rights that have been hard won. And they haven't been won by elites. They've been won by working class people in trade unions saying, we want to have freedom of conscience. We want to have freedom of expression. And so I'm using, as a Canadian citizen, my freedom of press rights, my freedom of expression rights. And so there are those in power that feel that I shouldn't be afforded those rights, that there should be limits on that. And I disagree. Unfortunately, in Canada, our Supreme Court just upheld these very Orwellian, draconian hate speech laws. Just, I think it was last week, in the past couple of weeks, where in a 6-0, vote in the Supreme Court, in which they said even if your statement is true, that truth is not a defense, right? So you can be criminalized for hating a group or hating a segment of society, and even if your statement about them happens to be true, you can be put in prison for your thoughts. So unfortunately, there is an attempt to criminalize certain thoughts. There are thought crime laws in this country. There are attempts to limit the press, because what the ideal perspective from the powers that be, they'd like us to look like a liberal democracy on paper and say, look, we have freedom of expression, and freedom of the press, but then you have all the media bought up by 3 capitalists. For example, in Canada, until very recently, 60% of the media was owned by Israel Asper, one rich, very ardent supporter of Israel, very ardent person on side with the war on terror. He owns 60% of our media. So that isn't really the kind of pluralism you need in the press. And I'm not for censorship at all. I don't believe Sun News should be censored. I don't think that the Globe and Mail should be censored or CBC should be censored. They should be free to make their arguments. But it's incumbent upon those of us who want a more just world to get off our butts and to do the hard groundwork, do the media, save up our pennies and get the equipment we need to get to do media work in order to debunk any myths or falsehoods that are propagated in the media. And from where I'm sitting, I see a lot of falsehoods and half-truths and untruths disseminated in the mainstream media, and I think that's problematic for a society. Another problem we have is the current immigration minister, Jason Kenney. He has been using the immigration laws to prevent speakers from coming into Canada, and the most notorious case was with George Galloway, a 5 times elected or 6 times now elected British MP who supports Palestinian rights, and he was declared a terrorist. He was actually called a terrorist and not allowed into Canada. So unfortunately, this Orwellian war on terror, and this is why addressing the truth about 9/11 is so important, because it's allowed this paradigm where there's the good guys and the terrorists, right? And if you get called a terrorist, you have no rights. You can just be stripped of your rights. There's secret courts. There's, you get called at, good cases, Omar Khadr. One of the most outrageous things that's going on in our media right now. You had this child soldier, Omar Khadr, who was kidnapped at gunpoint from Afghanistan as a child, taken to the Guantanamo Bay penal colony, the torture camp, and then his lawyer basically had to say to him, look, unless you confess to this crime, you're going to be here languishing in this dungeon your whole life, right? So he pled guilty to all the charges, one of which was, ironically, him being a war criminal when he was actually kidnapped by war criminals that were crusading and invading his country. and he gets called by the media week in, week out, self-confessed war criminal, convicted war criminal Omar Khadr, when there's no acknowledgement that his confessions were extracted while he was under duress in a torture camp. And so that's a good example of it's outrageous that they should be calling this child soldier a war criminal when any confessions were made under duress.
So obviously there's much better ways that the media can phrase and tell a story without demonizing somebody, without making them look like the absolute bad guy in any situation. And obviously there's many examples of this. One great example is the more recent incidents in the U.S. with the shooting, the Littletown incident. The Newtown shooting being one of the more major newsmakers. And rather than illustrate it as a tragedy, as a disaster, or as an unfortunate incident, they chose words that captivate the audience, make it sound evil, sadistic, words like the Newtown tragedy, the Newtown massacre. Instead of calling it an unfortunate incident, they had to use buzzwords such as like I said, the massacre, and even resorting to things like labeling him as a mentally ill individual, and the NRA coming out and proposing something as absurd as the idea of a registry for mentally ill people in the United States. So obviously, there's a big contrast in how people are sold by the media, and how the media tells a story versus how you and I would tell a story. So Josh, tell us, how can the media change and be more neutral in telling a story without demonizing somebody?
Yes, I think that there's an increasing segment of society that are always suspicious when these controversial and elaborate events happen, like 9/11, like 7/7, or like shootings. And so I think many people would like to stop, be cool, rational, evaluate the evidence. But as with 9/11, as with these shootings, you often get a trial by media. So with 9/11, for example, we were told this elaborate, sophisticated story about who did it, where we have to go now with our military, all within hours of the events of 9/11, rather than a cool, methodical, judicious investigation. And it's the same with these shootings, right? You never see, well, who did it? Could there have been some complicity of the powers that be to crack down on gun laws or intelligence agents, or, it was just a trial by media. This is who did it. He was a lone gunman. It's always a lone gunman. There's never any complicity in the highest echelons of society. And so that's how the media works. Trial by media, demonization, and guilty until proven innocent, rather than innocent until proven guilty.
Excellent. Well, folks, we're officially coming to the end of the show here. Once again, big thanks out to Joshua Blackeney with Press TV for joining us in studio here this evening. Just a couple of announcements before we wrap up the show. Make sure you check us out next week when we'll have our special guest Thomas Stone with Scandal Crew Media. And also make sure to check out our upcoming shows. We have some very new and exciting guests, including coming soon, some members of we'll call it a surprise guest for now, but we have some very well-known members of the Alberta government who are going to be joining us live in studio for our upcoming shows. So stay tuned for updates on when and where and who you'll get the opportunity of listening to. Make sure you stay tuned in, because coming up next, obviously, we've got Aisha Ali and the spoken word coming up next here on Fresh FM. So make sure you stay tuned for that. And once again, we'd like to thank everybody for tuning in tonight. We'd like to give a shout out to Tim Hortons for charging us $6 for coffee before the show tonight. Eventually, we might get a corporate sponsorship if we bug him long enough, so we're kind of hoping for that. But once again, we'd like to thank everybody for tuning in here to our pilot episode of Politically Inclined on Fresh FM. Again, a big thanks to Joshua Blackeney. And this is D.D. Benz here on Fresh FM saying thanks for tuning in. Make sure you check us out next week. And again, make sure you give a big shout out to Aisha Ali and give her some respects, because she's coming up next here on Fresh FM. That girl is awesome, that girl is wise, and she's going to bring you some awesome spoken word and some great history on all kinds of different music that you people are going to love. So make sure you tune into that. Once again, this is Dee Dee Benz signing out here on Fresh FM with Politically Inclined. And if you haven't had an opportunity, make sure you check out our page on Fresh FM. Coming soon will be the Politically Inclined page, and also make sure to check out any posts that might be providing information here about Dee Dee Benz on Fresh FM. And thanks again, folks, for signing in, and have a great evening. We will see you next week.